This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Energy Hub. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on virtual power plants, or VPPs, my guest is Ian Magruder, founder and executive director of the just launched Utilize Coalition. Ian's going to describe how and why big names in clean energy like Google, Carrier, Spark Fund, and Renew Home have come together to advocate for more complete use of the existing power system, which can limit increasingly unaffordable electricity rates. During Ian's over 15-year career in leadership, he headed Rewiring America's CEOs for Electrification Coalition, and in 2024 became Rewiring America's Director of Market Mobilization to expand that effort. In January, he became executive director of the Utilize Coalition to address today's suddenly new energy environment. He's also been a leader with the Truman National Security Project since 2014. So, Ian, let's start with a quick overview of the Utilize Coalition. And maybe while you're doing that, could you explain why you commissioned this new Brattle Group paper that's called The Untapped Grid, How a Better Utilized Power System Can Improve Energy Affordability? What's going on here, Ian?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Herman. Excited to dig into this.
Yeah,
Utilize is an industry-led coalition. We're focused on increasing grid utilization to make electricity cheaper, faster, and more reliable. And we work with policymakers, utilities, and a wide range of stakeholders across the energy landscape to unlock unused capacity on the electric grid. And so part of our work centers on education and research, helping policymakers and the public understand the significance and magnitude of the opportunity here. And the other part of our work focuses on direct policy advocacy, including helping governors, legislators, and regulators act to increase grid utilization through simple tech neutral mechanisms. And so on the first piece, public education, we really believe that grid utilization is an under-researched area. And we think that most Americans and policymakers really have no idea how much untapped capacity is sitting idle on the electrical grid at any given time, and this direct link between grid utilization and energy affordability. So we thought that a foundational piece on grid utilization, which could help measure the impact on affordability and illustrate some of the pathways to improving system efficiency, would be really helpful as a starting point that the industry could then build upon over time. And so we
that's the purpose of that paper, is what you're saying, right?
exactly. And so that's why we set out to commission this Brattle report. And we wanted to look at the load growth scenario in particular, because
Yeah,
that's, of course, the big question in the energy world right now is, with this significant increase in electricity demand that we're all witnessing due to data centers and new manufacturing and electrification and all the things that are contributing towards it, is this going to increase rates, or could new load, counterintuitively for some people, actually decrease rates? And that's what the study found. So we're really grateful that Rick O'Connell and his terrific team over at Grid Lab were willing to work with us and help fund this research. And so Utilize and Grid Lab and Brattle came together to make this report happen.
yeah. I've interviewed Rick and I've interviewed the folks from Brattle many times. They do great research. And I have to say that this paper and the coalition itself have started a conversation in the industry. You came along at just the right moment when what are the solutions for this coming load growth? Well, use the grid better. And I want to dig into that, Ian. Now, the paper itself talks about two approaches that a mid-sized utility system could use to meet this new demand. So tell us the basic question. Poor system utilization can drive the cost of electricity up, and greater system utilization can reduce the cost burden for the utility and its customers. So those are the two choices. Those are the two ways of thinking about this new load growth. Dig into that for us. Poor system utilization versus more system utilization.
Right. So, and I'm so glad that we're discussing this, because I think you're right. It seems like sparked a great conversation here. And before we get into the details of the study, I think it's worth just sharing up front that our grid is only roughly 50% utilized at any given moment
I'm
on
glad
the
you said
average
that.
day.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. And people don't realize, and I was going to explain that if you didn't, but that's good for you. That's and it's only used most of the hours of most of every day, right?
That's right. And that's because historically we've always had to build our grid to peak. We want to ensure that on the hottest summer day or the coldest winter night or morning in some cases, that when we turn on the lights, they'll come on. When we turn on the heat, it kicks in. Uh, and so we have to be prepared for those events. And historically, we just haven't had tools to meaningfully address flexibility. And we have those tools now. And so it really gives us an opportunity to think differently about the grid and build more towards system-wide utilization rather than just focusing on building the grid to peak.
So what you say when you say flexibility, what you mean is the ability to move some load, some demand to different hours than peak. So now the peak isn't as high, so you don't have to build new generation or new transmission capacity to meet it, right?
Yes, exactly, exactly. And just on the underutilization question and kind of how this ties to affordability, the simple analogy we use, which I know is imperfect, but is an airplane, right? If you build a fleet of expensive airplanes and then each plane is only flying 50% of the capacity of its passengers, on any given day, those tickets will be more expensive than if you can fill more of those seats, right? And so that's just one way of thinking about how if we can push more power through the existing system with the infrastructure we've built, we can lower prices. And so that's what this study gets into. And I'm happy to walk through it a little bit if that's what
Yeah,
you'd like.
yeah, definitely. So it's a matter of the money that goes into rates. Is that, am I saying that right? I mean, it's so the the if you have to build more transmission or generation infrastructure, the utility has to spend money. Now, if it's spending money just for those peak hours are going to cost more. Explain that a little bit better than I can.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one way to think about this is that you and I, Herman, and everyone listening today, we've all paid for the grid over time, right? There's so many fixed costs, and we're going to continue paying for it. We're going to continue upgrading it. But if we can get more out of the grid that you and I have already paid for, that will help us lower costs. And so the Brattle study really looks at this quantitatively, and they take a hypothetical rate case for a 3,000 megawatt mid-sized utility experiencing 1,000 megawatts of load growth. So 500 megawatts on the transmission connected side, another 500 megawatts on the distribution connected side. Transmission connected, think of data centers, other large load. Distribution connected, think of EVs, building up appliance upgrades, et cetera. And what the study found was that under the status quo approach of simply continuing to build out towards peak, that new generation, new transmission, new distribution infrastructure would be built to serve that new load, and the costs not recovered from the new load would be made up in a rate increase for customers. Specifically, the cost of serving those new customers would exceed the revenue collected from them. And so
Selling electricity, that the revenue from selling electricity, right?
exactly. And so the rate increase under the status quo scenario that smart folks at Brattle modeled was 1.4% to essentially make up for that shortfall. However, if we prioritize grid utilization through a wide range of technologies that I hope we'll get a chance to talk about here today,
Hmm.
the study found that a 10% increase in system utilization with this new load coming online, um, all the rates for all customers can be reduced by 3.4%, or in total a 4.8% shift relative to the status quo. So that 5% change is very meaningful, and they modeled that out. If you take a look and kind of extrapolate this across the country, across the next decade, Americans could save between, they say, 110 to 170 billion dollars over the next decade. So we see this as not a small affordability solution, but a potentially very meaningful affordability solution.
Okay, so it's pretty clear from the data that these researchers have used that money can be saved and then not uh, and then not drive up rates, electricity rates, if you can use the system more. If you can use more of the system more of the time, which means in many ways having a more flexible system so that less of the costs go into meeting the peak demand and more of the uses of electricity are spread out over the other hours of the system. Now, that's the
Exactly.
theory, but tell us a little bit about how to do that. I mean, not the theory of it, but in practical terms.
Sure. So there are a wide range of solutions that can help increase grid utilization, everything from distributed energy resources to demand response, advanced conductoring, et cetera. The Brattle report outlines 10 different categories that they think
Mm,
can meaningfully help improve grid utilization. I like to think of them in three primary buckets. So, bucket one, I would put distributed energy resources, distributed power plants. That can include things like battery storage, front of meter, behind the meter, all over the place. Smart thermostats that can preheat or pre-cool a building, depending on when electricity is either cheaper or more in demand. And then a second category of direct grid enhancements. So this can include things like grid enhancing technologies like dynamic line rating, and advanced transmission technologies like high performance conductoring, things that help us improve the existing poles and wires in our communities, neighborhoods, and across our states. And then the third bucket I would say is large load flexibility, and this can include things like demand response, data center flexibility, whether that's batteries on site or moving compute between locations. There are a lot of different ways to achieve large load flexibility. Historically, factories and manufacturers have participated in programs like this, and they're becoming increasingly sophisticated so that it's not simply going dark at a given moment, but can happen a little bit more dynamically and smoothly. So those are all things that can contribute. I think what's worth noting from the utilized perspective is that we're not in favor of mandating any one of these technologies. We actually think the right way from a policy standpoint to approach this is with a tech neutral approach. And so, set grid utilization as the key metric that we're trying to
right.
drive towards affordability, and let the best lowest cost solutions win. And each state might have its own approach to getting there. And we think that could be a great thing.
Here's a quick note from the sponsor of our series of podcasts about virtual power plants, Energy Hub. What if everyday devices had the potential to strengthen the grid when it's needed most? Energy Hub helps utilities turn that potential into dependable capacity by coordinating thermostats, EVs, batteries, and other devices so they work together as virtual power plants or VPPs that respond to grid needs in near real time. Energy Hub's latest white paper lays out a maturity model for VPPs that can be planned and dispatched with the same confidence as conventional plants while being 40 to 60% less expensive to build. That's why more than 160 utilities across North America partner with Energy Hub to manage over 2.5 million devices that provide 3.4 gigawatts of flexible capacity. Read the white paper and discover what VPPs can do for your grid at energyhub.com. Let's look a little bit at those three buckets that you just described. I completely agree with you that just set system utilization as the goal. It's neutral, and it's about reducing costs. Utilities want to reduce costs, customers want to reduce costs, politicians want to reduce. Who doesn't want to reduce costs? So there you go. Set that as your goal, and then choose from this smorgasbord or the three buckets, as you put it. You first talked about distributed energy resources. We've talked a lot about here on the podcast recently about virtual power plants. The idea, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, is that if you use customers to use their solar or use their solar and batteries at their home to get their electricity during peak hours, then you're not increasing the peak. And so the system is being used less at peak. That's part of system utilization. Am I wrong or right about that?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And whether you call them distributed power plants or virtual power plants, I think it's the same concept, which is uh, many individual resources, batteries being a great example, can all deploy simultaneously and collectively add up to, the same capacity as a traditional power plant. And solar is an interesting use case. I think solar, for it to be dispatchable, really does need to be paired with batteries, which is becoming increasingly common. And that's where VPPs are becoming more sophisticated, such that grid operators could treat them more like a traditional power plant. If it's fully dispatchable, and you
Hmm.
can say turn it on, turn it off, depending on when the grid needs it. That's what's becoming increasingly real, and it's gone from something that has been, piloted at a smaller scale to something that's really ready to scale up.
Yeah, and then you can use smart home thermostats like Renew Home does, and you can adjust them by 1 degree, and that reduces again the peak. And or you can pre-cool. You can increase the cooling before the peak. That's another form of utilization, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think the Renew Home team has said that they have something on the order of 3 or 4 gigawatts of capacity waiting to be unlocked if the right policies are in place to actually incentivize all of these thermostats to be synced up and used towards the grid. Managed EV charging is another example.
Right,
You know,
right. I
I
was just going
have
to talk about that.
I have
Yeah.
a giant battery sitting in my driveway right now, and I did the math, and even my small EV has the same capacity as 4.8 Tesla Powerwalls sitting there.
Wow.
So that's a lot of battery capacity. And most days I live in the city, it's fully charged, and whether through bidirectional charging or more practically in the short term, simply through managed charging, helping people if they're plugged in all night and most of the day, letting the system decide when is the optimal time to charge or to pause that charging is something that can benefit utilities, and they can pass some of those benefits along to customers. And so it's a potential win-win. So these are all examples of ways
Yeah.
that load flexibility can really help improve. And it
Right.
may seem small at an individual level of a building or a specific resource, but when we tie, thousands and eventually millions of
Right.
these individual actions together, it can be quite meaningful.
Right. I want to get to the two other buckets briefly before we move on to the last question, Ian.
Sure.
So the second bucket was ways to make transmission work better so that you don't have to build new transmission lines right away, and you don't have to build new generation because you can get more of the generation through the lines to the customers that need them. That's basically reconductoring with better wires that carry more power, or grid enhancing technologies, which are basically just software strategies to allow the transmission to carry more energy. Am I saying those things right? Do you agree with that as a form of utilization?
Yeah, that's right. And there's a whole, there are categories of things that fall within what we call ATTs, advanced transmission technologies, or GETs, grid enhancing technologies. And that can include dynamic line rating, power flow controls, advanced conductors. And these are things that, to your point, can take our existing power lines and help us safely and smartly push more power through them when the conditions are right. And historically, if we're not using these technologies, it's hard to know, how utilized is a specific line, what is the safe temperature at which to operate, how much power can go through it, um, and some of our lines simply, haven't been upgraded in the way that they can through advanced conductors. And so, we can always build out new lines, and we will need to build new transmission in this country,
Yeah.
absolutely. But whenever possible, it can be cheaper and more cost effective in many cases to improve the lines we have before we build out new ones.
Our system is going to need a lot of investment, but the advantage of utilization is that it allows planning for that spending so that at any one moment, the costs are not spiking rates in the way that we've been seeing in the last couple of years. I want to get to that third bucket briefly. The load flexibility is a topic that everybody's talking about. Can data centers be flexible? But what it comes down to is asking power plants, industrial plants that use a lot of energy to just a few minutes every so often, or an hour or two every so often, to just cut back a little bit. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
That's right. And there's again different ways of achieving this. Google just announced in the last week or two that they've now signed a gigawatt of data center demand response with
Yeah.
utility partners. And and so, they're putting massive batteries on site as one example. There's again, like I mentioned earlier, there's ways to, in some cases, move compute around. So you could ramp down one facility while you ramp up another, et cetera. And so, you could probably have a whole separate episode on that topic alone, but
Oh,
it's,
we've had several episodes.
yeah,
My friends Tyler Norris and Varun Sivaram are working on ways to make that happen at a scale. So we're excited about
exactly.
that kind of flexibility. I want to get to one more question, Ian, so I'm going to
Great.
cut you off there. Like you say, we have had podcasts and we're going to have podcasts on that topic. So it's covered. Um, Policymakers need to push for better system utilization. I think that's one of the messages that your coalition is getting across. What policies do they need to push for?
Yeah. So first, I would say that we see utilization as a core strategy for affordability and economic growth. And we believe that actually somewhat simple state level policy could really help unlock grid utilization at scale. One example is this legislation that we worked on and helped support in Virginia, which is Senate Bill 621, which is a one-page piece of legislation. And it essentially says two things. One, the utilities will provide grid utilization metrics to the Utility Commission, their regulator, and that will include metrics down to the substation and feeder level. So some real level of granularity in terms of what parts of the system are running at higher utilization and what parts maybe at lower utilization. And then those metrics can be used for the first time in the formal grid planning process, wrapped into the IRP.
There you go.
And that's something that really isn't happening in a meaningful way in any state in America. It may surprise folks, but we think that simply measuring utilization and beginning to incentivize it is really an important first step. And that will help surface the need for a variety of technologies. And to my earlier point, we don't believe in mandating any one of these. We think that we should let utilities and their regulators figure out what are the lowest cost, best solutions for their unique grid in specific locations at specific times of day, given that this is something that needs to be addressed at granularly.
Yeah, okay. We're running a little short of time, Ian, so I'm going to close it out there. That's a really good way to close it. I want to emphasize 2 points that you made. Number one, utilization is a growth concept. It's not, let's stop using electricity and put on our sweaters during the chilly mornings and that sort of thing. It's a way to increase activity without increasing cost, which is the best kind of growth. And the other point I want to make is that you mentioned getting these technology neutral concepts into utility planning. We've done a whole series here on utility planning at the podcast, and it's just something people completely overlook, which is that what can happen at the switches in everybody's homes, the electrical switches in everybody's homes, begins when utilities plan for the best, most cost-effective technologies. You mentioned that in passing. It's something I can't stress high enough, but that's all the time we have, Ian. I want to thank you. My guest has been Utilize Coalition Executive Director Ian Magruder. He's described why more complete utilization of the existing power system can limit increasingly unaffordable electricity rates and make our system grow. I also want to thank our sponsor, Energy Hub, and my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.